This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Rick Bragg is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, and he's on this edition of Conversations. The foothills of northeast Alabama and midtown Manhattan are worlds apart. But it was a small-town Alabama high school newspaper that would ultimately lay the groundwork for Rick Bragg to become a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at the New York Times. Bragg's success has reached far beyond the Gray Lady. As an author, he has penned critically acclaimed and commercially successful books. Titles like It's All Over But the Shoutin', Ava's Man, and The Prince of Frogtown capture the real and authentic life of personalities and places in the Deep South. Bragg's latest book is a biography of one of music's most complicated characters. In Jerry Lee Lewis's own story, Bragg gets unprecedented access to the iconic performer. Rick Bragg is also a regular contributor to Southern Living magazine and a professor at the University of Alabama. We're pleased to have Rick Bragg on this edition of Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
No, it's my pleasure.
Tell me about growing up in northeast Alabama.
Well, it sounds like something dragged out of the pages of a gothic Southern novel, but my mama really did pick cotton. She really did work on her knees, scrubbing other people's floors so that I'd have a chance to come sit and talk to you. Yeah. You know, she really did those things. My people were farmers and cotton mill workers, miners, roofed a lot of houses. Mm-hmm. Made a little whiskey.
Yeah.
Probably made a lot of whiskey. I grew up. We grew up poor. My mama stood in line for commodity cheese and peanut butter, and probably stood in line at the courthouse to get my daddy out of jail more than once. So it sounds picturesque. It probably wasn't at the time, but it was a good way to. If you're going to do stories for a living, if you're going to tell stories for a living, it was the best way to grow up I can think of.
How did you first get interested in writing?
Writing is the hard part of storytelling. Writing is the digging taters part of storytelling. It's kind of the manual labor of it. My people were always storytellers. My uncles could tell you a story, and you could hear the chains rattling in the pocket of the deputy as he chased them down an alley or down some red dirt road. They could tell a story, told it with imagery and detail and color. And so writing is really just putting it down, and my mother can tell one, my grandparents, my grandma especially, they can make you see a baby as it's born. They can make you see the glint of the pennies on a dead man's eyes. I mean, they could take you all the way through a life, with a good story. And how can you not be decent at it, functional at it, growing up with those people?
What makes a good storyteller?
I think let's put it this way. Have you ever had a rice cake? One of those freeze-dried, styrofoam-looking things you buy in a grocery, rice cake. Yeah. Did you like it?
Not really.
Have you ever had sausage gravy on a biscuit?
Yes.
Writing should be sausage gravy on a biscuit. Writing should be rich, should be redolent with flavor, and it should make you glad to be in it. I think that dull and spare may be a good fashion for some people, but that Southern writers in particular, not to be a stereotype. Right. Because I'm not one of those white suit wearing guys, right. But that Southern writing should be rich. You should see the red dirt in it. You should see the pine barrens, the dark black of the pine barrens. You should see, if you're writing about danger and dying, then it should be as real as a water moccasin. It should be that real. And a lot of writing teachers tell their students, save it for your novel, save it for the novel. Well, what are you saving it for? Yeah. I think writing should be rich. It should be It should be funny and sad, but more than anything, it should grip you and hold you.
Is storytelling a lost art form in today's world?
Well, that's a good question, because most of us want to say, no, it's not. Most of us want to say that, but technology is kicking it to death, I think. I think, texting is replacing conversation. Video games replace real experience. Now, when I was a child, I hate to sound like Grandpa Moses here, but when I was a child, we all knew what it was like to be in a fist fight. We all knew what it was like to have our nose flattened. We all knew what it was like to fall out of a tree. Now you fall out of a tree on video games. You get punched in the nose on video games. There's no danger. There's no consequence. So, yeah, I think it is threatened. I think reading, good books are almost shouted down, I think, by so many other noises out there. You got to think to read. You got to think to read, and you can't write if you don't read. So yeah, I think it is kind of under assault. That said, we all know a great book comes out, people flock to it, they cleave to it. So I do think that it is under assault, but for some reason, people still seem to want to read a good story.
Yeah. How old were you when you realized I can put pen to paper and I can tell stories and people will like them?
Well, it's kind of hard. My English teacher in high school told me that she said, I'm not sure you have the maturity to take English composition, and she was probably right. I had a '69 Camaro convertible that I bought doing pick and shovel work for my uncle, so that preoccupied most of my thoughts in high school. But in high school, my senior year, I realized that you could write dull, or you could look for and find the color, the imagery, the detail. Just write the way that your people tell those stories. Now, it took me a long time because I was working for a living writing when I was 18. I got a job at the Jacksonville, Alabama News. I got that job because the guy they offered it to first had a real good job at the Kentucky Fried Chicken and didn't want to give it up. So I was second choice and got the job. So, but it took, it was a process. I think I was in my late 20s before I realized that I might actually do something with it.
What was your career path like? Because you left the Jacksonville, Alabama paper and went on. Where'd you go after that?
Oh, I went a huge distance. I went all the way to Talladega, Alabama.
Okay.
I remember it was such a long drive in my car. My radiator always ran hot, so I'd have to stop in Munford to fill up my radiator. So it was a glorious beginning. But I went from the Jacksonville, Alabama News to the Talladega Daily Home, which was, I was a sports guy, a sports writer. You didn't want to trust me with anything complicated. And, it was about a 45-minute, hour-long drive. Then I got lucky. I got a job at the Anniston Star, which is one of the best small newspapers in the country. And that was a real luck because the Anniston Star was in my home county. Went from there to the Birmingham News and needed to make a living. I went to the Birmingham News. They were very good to me. Went from there to the St. Petersburg Times, which is one of the best newspapers in this country, any size. And there I went to the LA Times for 3 weeks, 2 days, 4 hours, and 27 minutes. I didn't like it. No. And then I went to the New York Times. But I kept moving up. I never graduated from college. I'm still technically a freshman at JSU, Jacksonville State University. Go Gamecocks. But I just kept going and found that people will promote you and treat you pretty good if you can tell a story.
What was it like for a small town southern boy to go to basically the newspaper that is considered, you know, the record of the nation, so to speak. I mean, the nation's newspaper, the New York Times.
I mean, it was a blessing. I mean, I'm not going to joke about it. I mean, it can be a tough, it can be a tough road. But, you know, it wasn't like I kind of catapulted from Calhoun County to Manhattan, because I had worked in between at places where people would kill you for your shoes. So but it was kind of funny. The doorman in the building where I lived, they put me up free for 6 months in Midtown Manhattan. So I actually walked home from work through Times Square, which I thought was kind of magical. Oh, yeah. You know, but of course, I almost froze to death too. But I stayed warm by stopping by the Popeyes fried chicken on the way home. All the places to eat in Midtown Manhattan, and I was drawn to the
Popeyes.
To Popeyes. God help me. But the doorman would, you know, he heard my accent and he thought it was just hilarious. You know, that, I mean, he must have thought that Jethro had been turned loose in the big city. And he'd tell me things twice. You know, whenever he told me, like, I'd say, "How do you get so and so?" And he'd tell me things twice to make sure I understood them. Now go to the corner, and turn left. Now that's that way. And it was pretty funny, actually.
You won the Pulitzer Prize while at the New York Times.
I was very lucky. I always was assigned or pitched stories that were the most important thing I think that you write about in this world is living and dying. And you know, I covered the Oklahoma City bombing, covered prisons for the aged and infirm, and I went to Haiti and wrote about the killing there. I covered briefly the militant Islamic fundamentalism on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Very briefly, never could claim to be an expert on any of those things, but you know, my job was to write about the human loss in those things, and so I mean, I had every opportunity to do well. I had good bosses, thoughtful people, and I'm glad I did it. But I never wrote anything that meant as much to people as writing about home.
Writing the books.
Yeah.
How did you transition from newspaper journalist to author?
Well, that's a good question too, because it's, you know, I think a lot of people think that there are two styles of writing. There is journalism and there's literature, and there's a drastic difference between the two. There's really not. that you know, the kind of thing that we did in the newspaper stories were long features, magazine type things, and they lent themselves to kind of a narrative storytelling. So it seemed to make sense. You know, what are you going to write a book about? Well, they always tell you write what you know. Well, what do I know? I had a call from with a great editor in New York who said, "Don't know who you are or you know where you're from really, but if you want to write a book, let's talk." And I got a call from an agent, one of the best literary agents in the world, maybe the best. Said, "Don't know who you are or where you're from, but if you want to write a book, I'll represent you." Wow. So I got lucky, and the book that we wanted to write was a love story about the South and the blue-collar South, and about my mother and her place in it. So I wrote my hard book, my important book, first, which also was lucky. Man, you cannot discount luck in this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. But you got to be good.
Well, you know, it don't hurt to be able to tell a story. But I mean, I really, you know, there'd been a time as a young man where I would have said, "Well, yes, you do have to be good." But I think as you get older, you do realize that very little in this whole life is planned. And that sometimes, especially in the writing world and writing life, that you're really kind of just you're just a twig rolling down a creek, and you don't have a lot of say if you don't have some luck. And I had luck all along the way.
You're obviously very close to your mom. What What did she say when you wrote the book about her? What did she say?
Well, you know, when I told her I was going to write the book, I don't think she understood. I think she thought that it'd be one of those, be like a pamphlet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it'd be like something that you wrote and you went and you had mimeographed at the school office, you know, and I don't think she knew that it would be a book that wouldn't one day knock on selling 1 million copies.
Wow.
I don't think she knew that. A reporter came to interview her after the book came out, and said, well, Miss Bragg, what have you been doing since the book came out? And my mom, and you'd have to understand, you know, she is just so understated and so without any ego. She said, well, I've just been walking around up here on this pedestal my boy put me on, trying not to fall off. And the reporter, who was much better than me at this stuff, said, well, what's the best day of your life? What's it been? And I thought my mama would say, well, when my boy wrote that book about me, or when my boy won that prize, or when my boy... And she said, well, actually, it was the birth of my first boy, my brother Sam. And she launched into this little story about, you know, coming home from the hospital and, you know, had nothing. Didn't even have a place to bring the baby back to. Had to bring it back to my grandmother and grandfather's. And the next day, my grandfather told her, said, Margaret, you kept me up all night talking to that blame boy. And the reporter, again, who's much better than me, said, well, what were you saying? And my mom said, well, I just kept looking at him. And, you know, I never had a doll. So I just kept looking. I never had anything of my own. So I just kept looking at him and saying over and over again, you're mine. Well, you know, that reporter is much better at what she does than I'll ever be. Yeah. And my mama's a better storyteller than I'll ever be. So that's what I mean, luck. You know, I just happen to be, you know how people talk about lucky genes, you know, lucky genes? Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I just had lucky genes.
You mentioned your grandfather. You wrote about your grandfather.
Charlie Bundram, yeah.
Tell me about him.
He was a bootlegger. You know, bootlegger sounds ugly. You know, bootlegger sounds like you got a poker game going in back of your joint, and you know you're selling hooch by the glass. No, he made whiskey. He was a moonshiner. He worked the ridges and the hollows and the foothills of the Appalachians along the Alabama-Georgia line. He worked both sides, around Rome, Georgia, Cherokee, Calhoun County, that area around in there. And he was about 6'2", had those long muscles, never lost a fist fight. He was a roofer in his legitimate job, carpenter, but he made good liquor. And he made it in the teeth of the Depression. And he, you know, helped keep his family alive. And lost one child to simple dehydration. So, you know, he was picturesque. And he deserved a book. And I never met him. He died the spring of the year before I was born. So I thought, well, you know, I write stuff. Why don't I make me a grandfather? Why don't I build me a grandfather from the stories of my people? And that was probably my favorite book. Mama's book, All Over But the Shouting, was the more important. But for the joy of writing, Ava's Man was most fun I've ever had.
Your latest book, speaking of fun, because it had to be interesting, Jerry Lee Lewis and his own story. How did you come about writing about Jerry Lee Lewis, of all people?
Well, the short answer, I guess, is I get a call from I'd love to say that there's some picturesque reason, you know, that Jerry Lee saved my life in a bar fight in Pascagoula in 1979. But that ain't it. My agent called me and she said, you got any interest in doing a book on Jerry Lee Lewis? And what I should have done was hid under the bed, you know, and left the phone off But I went and met with him, and you know, Jerry Lee's got some age on him now. You know, he's knocking on 80, and he, you know, I looked at him and it was still Jerry Lee. You know, it was the guy that made Elvis cry. It was the guy that almost sent Johnny Cash into some kind of toxic shock. It was the guy who set a piano on fire and almost caused Chuck Berry to have an embolism. I mean, you know, it was the guy who hit a guy in the face with the butt end of the microphone stand as he tried to crawl up on stage and insult Jerry Lee on stage. And, you know, the guy who married his 13-year-old cousin and went from the pinnacle of rock and roll to playing honky-tonks in Iowa and fighting his way out. So I thought that was a story.
Yeah.
And you know, if what you want to do as a writer, and people can talk about content and they can talk about substance, but one of the things you want to do as a writer is not bore yourself or the reader. And Jerry Lee Lewis was perfect.
What was that day like when you first met him?
Jerry Lee has a pack of dogs in his yard. And I'm not making this up, he has a big pack of dogs. And he has, so I got past that pack of dogs and didn't get bit until I got inside, where a pack of, and I'm not making this up either, Chihuahuas roam the house. One of them, a particularly vicious little dog named Topaz Jr. So yeah, I mean, I walk in the door, and there is this guy, this tall, thin man, a little hunched over from arthritis, but it's Jerry Lee Lewis. Still, hair's still the same, you know, silver now instead of gold.
Right.
But it was, I almost didn't know what to say.
Yeah.
You know.
What was the process like as you interviewed him over, I'm assuming, a fairly extended period of time?
Well, his health had declined, and now he's doing much better now. But his health had declined, so what I did was we needed to go long days. So, and he could not sit for very long, so we decided, well, we'll just do him in his bedroom. So he would prop up in the bed, and I would sit in a rocking chair, which, as I have said before, rocking chair is rapidly becoming my favorite mode of transportation. and I sat there and rocked, and we talked. And I took notes. I didn't record the sessions. I took notes, and he just kind of took me by the elbow and walked me off down, you know, Sun Records in 1957, 58. You know, on tour with Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins, you know, in 57. You know, Wanda Jackson on stage in Calgary, you know, in the late 50s. Singing with Sam Cooke, singing with Jackie Wilson. Playing the piano as Elvis leaned on the piano lid. You know, hour after hour after hour, sometimes playing the same song over and over again. The only time I think Elvis was at peace. And, you know, of course, you know, crashing his Lincoln Continental into the gates of Graceland, going to see Elvis drunk one night, champagne drunk. And you couldn't make it up.
Yeah.
You know, he flipped a Rolls Royce. He was doing as fast as a Rolls Royce would go. Couldn't make a turn, flipped his Rolls Royce, and the police were chasing him, of course. And so they all pull up. Some of them even got their hands on the butt of their pistols, and they said, "Jerry Lee, get on out of there. You know, his car's upside down." And most of us would say, "Okay, officer." Yeah. Jerry Lee wouldn't get out. He said, "I ain't coming out until I hear the end of this song it's playing in the tape deck." So, you know, you can't make it up, you know. You can't make it up.
I've got about 3 minutes left. I
Yeah.
wish I had another half an hour with you, but anyway, I've got about 3 minutes left. One of the things that people really like, they really enjoy your essays that you do for Southern Living magazine. How did that come about?
Well, I've always done magazine work. I've done it for everybody from the Smithsonian to Sports Illustrated to ESPN to, I did stories for Gourmet and Food and Wine. I mean, I just love magazine work. It's kind of like candy, It's fun but Southern Living has this back of the book column called the Southern Journal, and I did a couple of them, and I enjoyed them. They're short. They kind of force you to take an idea and boil it down, and it can be something as simple as a houseboat trip you took with your Aunt Edna and Uncle Charlie in 1964. It can be your brother digging in the red dirt to find some kind of peace, and pride in producing a garden. It can be shooting mistletoe out of the tree with a shotgun at Christmas time. So, it's softer and gentler than anything I've ever done.
Right.
But maybe soft and gentle isn't such a bad thing for a fellow who thinks a rocking chair is a good way to go. Yeah. But I enjoy it, and the people have responded. There's a lot of crossover in readership, and the people have really responded beautifully. And so that now when we have a book signing, I sign a lot of copies of Southern Living.
Interesting. He's keeping storytelling alive through his books and Southern Living magazine. The latest book is Jerry Lee Lewis and his own story. Pulitzer Prize winning Rick Bragg. What a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Oh, listen, this was my pleasure.
Best of luck to you.
Oh, and to you.
Thank you so very much. Rick Bragg, great writer, great storyteller, and I know you'll enjoy many of his books, and certainly the Jerry Lee Lewis story. Wow. As I mentioned before, he is a complicated fella. He's an interesting fella. By the way, you can see some more of our conversations. Nowhere near as interesting probably as Jerry Lee Lewis, but nonetheless some interesting conversations online at WSRE.org/conversation. You can also find us on YouTube and on Facebook. Thank you so very much for watching. I'm Jeff Weeks. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take great care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.